Warning: the following video contains references to substance abuse, self-harm, mental illness, trauma, death, gender dysphoria, existential dread, and cringe. Viewer discretion is advised. Mayo Clinic describes dissociative disorders as follows, quote, "Dissociative disorders are mental disorders that involve experiencing a disconnection and lack of continuity between thoughts, memories, surroundings, actions, and identity. People with dissociative disorders escape reality in ways that are involuntary and unhealthy, and cause problems with functioning in everyday life. Dissociative disorders usually develop as a reaction to trauma and help keep difficult memories at bay. Symptoms, ranging from amnesia to alternate identities, depend in part on the type of dissociative disorder you have. Times of stress can temporarily worsen symptoms, making them more obvious." Unquote. So with that clinical and not all-encompassing definition out of the way, let's finally finish the astral story with altars, brief mentions of demons, and some complicated necromancy. Hey everyone, I'm V for Verbatim, and no matter how hard I try, my stories are going to be problematic. Today, we're going to be finishing the astral story, and if you couldn't tell by the clinical opening, DID is involved. Dissociative identity disorder, or formerly known as multiple personality disorder, is something that I've kind of always found fascinating. As a kid, I watched this show pretty casually, but became super interested when a character with DID was introduced. Surprisingly, that character was one of the more accurate examples of DID that I've seen, at least until the guy suddenly had an evil personality and could turn off his other personalities with an off switch in his brain. God damn you, Split. If you don't know, Split was a M. Night Shyamalan film, already a good sign, about a guy with DID kidnapping teenage girls and releasing the beast personality within. Seriously, don't get me wrong, the movie was interesting and James McAvoy earned my respect with his acting chops. I might actually do a review on that movie in the future. But there was plenty of misinformation that was spread because of that film. As a person that really enjoys the use of the mind as a main plot device, I have implemented dissociation, split minds, all of that jazz in my stories. It was, and still is, very harmful that I spread those kind of things in my story. Maybe I just liked the idea of having a character that could be sympathetic but also pure evil. Maybe I liked the idea of having another person in your mind because then you never have to be alone. But either way, the whole idea of mind demons in my world really started out as characters with split personalities before I changed it to be more of a parasitic relationship after finding out a little bit more about DID and what it actually entails. Given what I've learned about DID recently though, I really wanted to take this story as an opportunity to address some misconceptions about the disorder and humanize those diagnosed with it, as well as all alters involved in each DID system. So if you're down for that, let's step into the story and hopefully not anger too many people. So I may have touched on this briefly in a past video, but the Astral family is slightly dead. As a doornail, in fact. They never had kids as of the rewrite, but Memori Astral, the second sister to die, did take a piece of each of her siblings' souls and sent them out into the world to lay dormant, which is part of another story and another branch of the Astral family saga kind of thing. Her own soul fragment actually split into two, and the first entered the body of a child 50 years later, the grandchild of a woman she had loved while studying abroad in Japan. The child, Miyoko, was raised in Australia by an adopted family, but he remembered nothing of his early life. His mind split as a result of repressed trauma, but he didn't realize they existed until one alter attempted to overdose on Emperor and he woke up in the hospital. He traveled to America with his family sometime after that, and tons of therapy happened in between. He traveled to America, where he found the remains of the Astral family. Just fragments of their crystals within the remains of Max Astral's tech empire. Chicago is rubble at this point, something I'll explain another day. Anyway, Miyoko has the necromancy powers of his soul mother, Memori, and in his attempt to revive the Astrals, the energy within the shards fuses with him, entering his altars and giving them new forms. When he returns to Australia, he finds that his altars have changed and can now manifest in the world alongside him in new astral forms. They find out how to use their powers, they fight villains, Miyoko a little bit more reluctantly, and yeah, that's pretty much it for the summary, because this one's a little bit more of a concept than an actual story. So before we start the redraw, here's a few things to note about the world building and general layout of this world. So first of all, the altars are pieces of Miyoko's personality. And the altars tend to have unique forms and unique looks from one another, but to really establish them as a unit and as a sort of group mind, Miyoko and his pals have very similar features. Like, they all have a right parting to their hair, being the more prominent side. They all have a gap between their front teeth, because I thought it looked kind of... I just liked the way that it looked, honestly. And then there's the right eyes, of most of them being blackened and dead, except for Alex, who we will get to. It just makes it clear that, while they're unique personalities, they're all part of one body. A second thing to note about the story is that the Astral Family's influence is physical rather than mental. Their minds are completely gone in this story. These are not the same characters. So while the altars have their own personalities, the power of the Astral Family, for example, their actual abilities, are actually seen in the altars, and the broken appearance of the altars' forms is representative of the brokenness of the Astral Family, their gems, and just the fact that they were murdered. I think the best example of this would be Cammy. They're missing body material, so they stay very small. They don't age, they stay that very, very small size. And all of them in the world of the story, not necessarily the drawing, have occasional mental glitches as well. So they stop talking mid-thought due to a lack of processing once held in the gem, and they are forced to reset. But that's only when they're in their astral forms. When they're, like, the lead personality in Oko, they have, like, full capability of speech and all that. The only time that they experience these mental glitches is when they're in the forms that are going to be drawn out for you guys today. Thirdly, this story is more about internal conflicts, with physical conflicts being more symbolic manifestations of the struggles of Miyoko's DID system, as DID is one of the lesser understood disorders and generally the one that has a lot of stigma attached to it. So let's just talk about some major internal conflict. Superheroes were made illegal, but Oko's altars constantly want to get involved in crimes to protect people, and that's kind of a manifestation of the Astral Family's influence and them wanting to be heroes despite society telling them that they can't, basically. Again, it's not the Astrals themselves, but it is some of their influence coming through. And then another thing, Miyoko doesn't want to lose his altars and be left alone in his own head, so they're getting these new forms and stuff in the story because of the Astral Family's influence. And that doesn't necessarily sit well with him, because now he's like, oh, well, they have their own bodies, they have their own forms, what does that make me? Does that make me alone? Does that leave me here by myself, kind of thing? And he just has to learn how to cope with that idea, even though it technically doesn't come to that. A really last thing is that the new Refraction Force doesn't know if they're themselves the Astral Family or if they're the altars, and some of them struggle to defy their Astral Family coding as a result. Most specifically, Meridian, who we will be getting to. And then here's some of the external conflicts. There's a new big industry taking over the world in Max's place. Again, you might have to go back to an old video to understand exactly who Max is, and I will be releasing a video about the major industry owners, because that is a very significant part of this kind of world that I built. So anyway, in Max's place, this organization called Bliss takes over, which is owned by a guy named Arthur Agrath, who I did not name, for the record. And that guy just happens to be Oko's adoptive father, by the way. So definitely kind of awkward that an evil businessman is also in charge of this hero kid. Another thing is the intergalactic politics, always fun. So as the heirs of this Pilagaran royal, again, this is another thing from a previous video, so you might want to go back to some of those. So as the children of royals in space, basically, the Astral Family were expected to solve Earth-based disputes involving demons, Maristinians, and many others, and that comes into play more in this story than it ever did in the Astral story. So in this story, there would be a lot more demons, a lot more aliens, a lot more kind of off-planet kind of stuff, just for a little bit of variety. And lastly, there's also just other minor villains also involved in the story. This is more of an episodic kind of thing that I was thinking. I do like the idea of there being a larger story involved, because again, this is a continuation of the Astral story, which is kind of integral to a lot of other things that happen throughout the universe that I've created. But at the same time, I value the viewer, and I want it to be a place where no matter how far in you are, or how much you know about this kind of stuff, I want it to be a place where, yeah, you can just jump on in at any point, any episode, and there's something there for you to enjoy, or just generally kind of connect with, kind of thing. Generally inclusive kind of environment, not just for longtime fans, or for any fans at all, because I don't have any yet, so... and I don't even have any stories yet, so... yeah. But my point is, just be a place for everybody, no matter what kind of story it is. So, that's my thoughts. I'm just gonna keep going, though. For major conflicts again, some of the major villains are going to be Arthur Agarath, as I mentioned before, the owner of Bliss and the business guy, and also his son Alexander Agarath, who's also important to this story, or would be. We also have Amira Waters, and I don't have much for her yet, but she's basically a siren kind of character. Also, See No Evil is another group along with that. Unlike the sirens who use the power of their voices, the See No Evil group, they don't look at people because their power comes from sight, kind of thing. I haven't really established much for them either, so that's again more of a concept than anything, and I don't even know if I would draw these guys out yet. And then there's also the Demon King, another character I have not established yet, but I imagine would be very fun to play around with. Demon Scouts, of course, we would have a couple of, like, drones kind of thing, and just them interacting with the main crew, and the main crew having to deal with demons. And by the way, we will be getting to a lot more demon lore eventually, which, for the record, I did a bunch of research on demonology, and also angel mythology and general, that kind of stuff, because that stuff is really fascinating, by the way, so... honestly, comparable to DID, like, seriously, I find both the concept of, like, philosophies and generally just understanding the brain, I find that's my favorite combination, so this story kind of covers all of that, even if it's not very well thought out, so sorry. And we'd also have to have a couple of other aliens, of course. We got Maristinians, Norcasians, that kind of stuff, and all of these we'll be getting to eventually. And again, I may draw these characters later, who knows? They're really concepts, mostly exclusive to this rewrite in a couple of cases, so I haven't drawn a couple of them yet. So, yeah, that's just a bunch of ideas thrown out there. Might cut this bit too, but yeah. Another thing, this story is less about heroes and more about identity. Being a story about DID, this idea of heroes being illegal and the world being out to get Miyoko for trying to be a hero is more so a commentary about mental health stigmas than a good versus evil kind of typical hero story. As an extension of this unconventional good versus evil story concept that I'm going with, these characters exist in different forms across story, and I'm referring specifically to the Nightmare timeline, which is another unconventional good versus evil kind of story. In that instance, Miyoko is actually the son of Momori, who isn't directly related to the rest of the Astral Family, and several of the personalities that we are going to be seeing here exist as the children of the Astral Family, while others don't exist at all, Marie, for example. Lastly, if you find the discussion of trauma, thoughts of self-harm, or addiction triggering, this is my last warning. This story leans a little bit more in that direction, so I really want you guys to be aware before we start. And now, let's talk about these characters. Miyogo, or just Oko, is a young man originally from Japan. After events in his childhood that he no longer remembers, which I will say outright are related to paternal abuse of some kind, he was sent to Australia and adopted by a corrupt tech company CEO, who actually treated him fairly well, if a little bit absent. He started to recognize severe memory problems early into his teens, one memory lapse ending with him in the hospital, as we've mentioned before. One of his alters tried to end their lives, an unresolved issue that comes up later in the story when that specific alter actually confesses to it. Oko was placed in therapy and became acquainted with his alters. That's one misconception I'd like to mention. People with DID don't always know about the existence of all of their alters. Oko had only really met, or at least knew about Meridian and Oz before they were each given their own form. Anyway, Oko had his own powers before, necromancy and future vision like Momori. While he didn't use necromancy much, he occasionally used his third eye to predict outcomes for betting purposes or for meeting people. After the creation of forms for the altars based on the Astrals' energy, he was kind of thrown in the backseat of his mind while the others became restless and tried to take the front wheel kind of thing. He struggled to maintain relationships, he couldn't stick to his own moral compass when 5 other personalities were fighting for control, and he became increasingly worried about losing his altars altogether and being left to face the world alone. While that never actually happens, he comes to terms with the fact that he is his own person and he begins to move on. His personality is stabilizing as a result. Miyoko is generally quirky and a little bit cocky and thoughtless at times. He's generally the most affectionate of his personalities. He tends to have a lot of social confidence, but he struggles romantically, something Meridian, his other personality, tends to step in for. He's a nerdy tinkerer, and while he's proficient with his powers, his real strength comes from his ability to build things. In fact, his jacket is a weapon in of itself, with built-in tools and weapons. It would make going through airport security a nightmare, if you know what I'm saying. Miyoko is the host identity of his DID system, but he isn't exactly the largest personality. That would certainly be a tie between Meridian and Alex. Speaking of, Meridian is an 18-year-old alter with Spanish origins. So yeah, he has the slightest accent and he can speak Spanish. It's definitely off-putting when Oko suddenly speaks another language in front of people who know him. Triggers that send Meridian into the driver's seat include verbal altercations and more notably awkward romantic situations, at which point Meridian either makes things better or 100 times worse. He's the one that co-operates their DID system with Oko the most. And by that I mean that he and Oko can both be conscious together, because Meridian considers Oko's feelings when he's in charge. He was the original protector of the DID system before Oz, the older brother of the system, and he was the first alter altogether. He's also one of the alters that doesn't age, so while he is one of the oldest for now, he's forever 18 and Oko is going to catch up with him eventually. Hence why a new protector alter took his place. While his hero uniform doesn't exactly communicate it, Meridian tends to dress more punkish or occasionally more feminine depending on what he's feeling. He's similar to Jackson in that he's the most emotionally sensitive and he's the one everybody else turns to. But because of their similarities, Meridian fears that he isn't his own person. He finds Jackson's old powers in shattered form familiar, so he questions how legitimate his own existence is. He overcompensates by doing things Jackson would never have done in his previous life. Generally dressing very alt, getting piercings, sometimes trying substances he probably shouldn't, and in line with Oko and his romantic exploration, being openly gay and pursuing relationships outside his DID system. It makes him appear selfish and childish at times, so despite being Miyoko's guide through hard times in his early life, Oko's become more of a friend to his alter and occasionally has to rein Meridian in. Outside of story purpose, Meridian really likes building things as much as Oko, and he loves music despite not playing any instruments like Oko, who actually plays the guitar. Pretty much your typical bad boy, but the music he listens to tends to be on the less angsty side, more power ballads than heavy metal. He's really a sweetheart, and Meridian believes that he was the ideal life that Miyoko wanted when he was a child. Free, kind, and loving, hence why he became Oko's first alter. He's missing an eye and a hand, neither of which that he minds very much, but to make people less uncomfortable, he lets his hair fall over his face, both as an alter and in his own form. Clement, or Cammy, is a child alter in a DID system. They're 5 years old, and they were Oko's second alter. They're actually an angel. That's something not really talked about with DID. Alters can be animals, or things, or even like mythical or spiritual creatures like angels. The same endlessness comes with age as well, like they can be 5 years old, or they can be without age at all. So all of that is to say that Cammy is a child angel that takes over for the system when Oko's anxieties cloud his judgment. And Cammy kind of tries to smooth things over in the only way that they can. While Cammy is the baby of the family, they are very observant, and what they don't understand, they question. They're a creative soul that pushes Miyoko to think more creatively when they're in control. Cammy knows that they're not supposed to let anybody but friends and family know when they're running things, since people have taken advantage of people with DID when littles are the ones in control. though occasionally due to their high energy, they forget and get Oko into weird, sometimes dangerous situations. They don't really mind the idea of Caroline Astral's consciousness existing alongside theirs, if that is the case, but they do think of her like an imaginary friend that Cammy needs to cheer up. They know what Caroline's life was like, and they really just want her to be happy. So when fighting villains, they ask Caroline for advice, but whether Cammy's imaginary friend is actually Caroline is unknown. Though supposedly Cammy can communicate with the souls of the Astral Family when he's dreaming, so perhaps Caroline is actually Caroline. In everyday life, Cammy often takes the driver's seat for Oko, which means that Cammy has a lot of time to be the kid that Oko never got to be with his difficult family situation. They play with toy trains and they love coloring books. Oko sometimes takes on babysitting jobs so that Cammy has time to play with children their age, so Cammy's really sociable and loves to teach. All in all, Cammy is an angel and definitely beyond this world, but they're really a typical kid and one of the more interesting alters in my opinion. Oz, or Austin as Oko originally called her, is a 21-year-old and Oko's only female alter. He assumed she was male though, which is why he would call her Austin originally until she renamed herself Oz. She creates the mental space where alters not in the spotlight reside. She's a mother figure for their system, and she comes out when Oko's broken down so that she can pick up the pieces. She appeared much later on in Oko's life, and she is capable of aging unlike some of the others. Oz is morally straight and has a calming presence. She has a lot of pride for what she does, which occasionally comes across as arrogance. She's driven primarily by her moral compass, and given Meridian's tendency to rebel, the two eldest alters don't get along very well. She's very much a mother, and that's also the case in battle. It limits her usefulness when she's worried over, say, Cammy getting themselves hurt or Oko trying to carry everyone else, but she is a very loving mother and a very loving person in general. Oz's powers, like Meridian's, feel familiar to her, but she kind of feels bad about using them when the man that used them before is dead. Out of respect, she only uses the third ability Lucas never figured out how to use, Reflection. She uses illusions and mirrors to confuse opponents. She's heard stories about Lucas Astral falling to his own stresses and that kind of thing, so she's very reflective of her own actions to avoid repeating history. Also, Lucas's shattered form has no legs due to the damage that he sustained at Max's hand, so you will note that Oz has robotic legs in place of where her legs would have been. Oz doesn't come out for very long when she does. Though generally not very romantically driven like Meridian or Miyoko, she canonically only likes women, representing another opposite trait to Meridian. She's mostly looking after the other alters and unfortunately continues the pattern Lucas started by putting her own interests in life aside for the sake of the well-being of the system. She does, however, love gardening, so when Oko comes back after she takes over, he sometimes finds plants in his room that weren't there before, which he of course leaves out of respect. While not the most remarkable alter story-wise, Oz is one of the happier endings for an Astral Family member. Alexander, or Alex, is Oko's most recently identified alter, and is the most unstable. He takes the form of a 16-year-old ice giant that ages alongside Oko. He was also the one that tried to overdose. He takes over whenever Oko is forced to remember suppressed memories, and either becomes verbally or physically violent around people as a coping mechanism. He's a threat to Oko's well-being at times, and is believed to be a confused combination of Oko's abusive father and several of Oko's past romantic partners. Alex is a representation of toxicity in Oko's life. He really does care about Oko, but he expresses that in ways that are unproductive and damaging to Oko. He tends to resort to violence to get his point across to people, so he is bitterly loyal to the point of recklessness. He's probably the most terrified of the entire system. He can be a coward, and that fear, plus the combination of his intense emotions, is what causes him to become so violent. So unlike this traditional evil personality seen in a character with DID, Alex is Oko's abuse and childhood trauma, but he is equally the product of abuse. A broken, hurting person that clings tightly to what he has left to care about. Oko in this case. Alex is his own person, but he does become a little bit obsessed with Matthew's story and this idea of a mind demon that frees one from conformity. He distances himself from the other alters naturally, but he really closes himself off to learn Matthew's ice powers and later his power over matter. In his ice giant form, he tries to convince Oko and the others to give up their consciousnesses and let the Astrals take over. And while he accepts that they don't want to do that, he still tries to do so for himself. It never works since Matthew's consciousness is so fractured from all this other stuff that goes on in his story that he has no influence on Alex at all. But through Alex's failure, he kind of learns to chill out, pun very much intended, and accept that he's his own person. So as a contrast to Meridian's story, he must accept that he has full control over his actions, not some outside source that he desires as a means to escape from his own misguided choices. While Matthew is a lot of angst and story, he's also a dude with his own life and interests. He likes learning new skills, but he tends to lose interest in them when he isn't immediately amazing at them, so that really speaks to what his personality is like. He did take up boxing as a more healthy means of expressing frustration. Oko and some of the other alters like Oz download court drama shows like Judge Judy and that sort of thing for him, since he seems to like that kind of thing. He's also probably the most dissatisfied with his form. He doesn't accept Oko or his ice giant projected self as him, and when he does interact with the other alters, he asks Cammy to draw pictures of what his face would actually look like. I'll add a picture or two of what he actually looked like in an alternate story, or a couple of character maker versions of him, but yeah, he doesn't actually see himself as a frost giant, even though Cammy sees themselves as an angel, and is very similar to him in the fact that they're not actual human beings. He's closest to Oko mostly because of their strained romantic relationship. Yes, two alters in love with each other, just kinda go with it. It's initially an unhealthy codependent relationship, but as Alex learns to come to terms with his existence, and Oko becomes a more stable person, the two of them become the more ideal versions of themselves and become a better pair. Like his astral counterpart Charlotte, this is going to be pretty short. Will was Oko's fourth alter, and he was there before Alex was even named or even a person. He resembles a younger version of Oko's therapist. He's 12 years older, and he works alongside Oz to establish peace and order within the system, occasionally to an obsessive extent. He takes over almost as often as Cammy, but is a little more difficult to deal with. He never cooperates with Oko, and is seen as a huge stick in the mud by the other alters. If anything, he and Alex are the greatest threats to Oko's stability. Will constantly tries to take over Oko's life, and Alex tries to protect him from Will and his lack of autonomy through violence, which separates him further from the real world around him. Will isn't much like Charlie. If anything, he's more like Lucas and even Momori. Because of the way Charlie died, her spirit was content enough to continue on. That leaves very little left of Charlie physically, which makes Will the least stable. His power occasionally fails or just completely explodes out of his control, which is his main struggle in combat. It's also how he and Oz kind of like interact, is like Oz kind of tries to teach him how to control his powers. William has a soft spot for animals and collects them the same way Oz collects plants. Being a very type A guy, he's the one that organizes Oko's life by color, size, and content. So yeah, that's really all that there is to him. He's kind of just there. Like I said before, this is more of a concept than a story. I imagine it would be partially slice-of-life moments with Oko and the alters coming and going, either resulting in hilarity, misunderstandings, or some kind of drama. That style of episode would be accompanied with antagonists that fit the tone. Oko's emotionally distant adopted father, Will and Alex's turbulent personalities, Oko's various exes, that kind of stuff. But on the other end, there's the deeper, lore-based story and continued story of the Astral legacy. The powers and physical forms of the alters are taken on from the Astral Family, and the conflict between bringing back the Astrals versus validating the existence of the alters is the main piece of world building, with otherworldly political conflict and rebuilding the world after a massive near-apocalypse kind of taking the backseat despite being more interesting. I swear that stuff will all be important and expanded on later, but to start out with, we really need to understand the Astrals, where they were, and their legacy now. The Astrals aren't there in the usual sense, but there's something new instead. In the end, most of the alters stay with Oko in their system, the only exception being Alex. Alex separates from Oko somehow. And he and Oko stay together as their new, better selves. Oko becomes more in control of his life and emotions, and him and the others become more effective heroes. They continue fighting crime indefinitely after restoring the hero system, due to their work as vigilantes for the sake of Australia. The curtain closes, the end, that's all folks, and that's pretty much it. Over 50 years after the deaths of the Astral Family, the world is in a state of chaos. After a catastrophic event involving heroes and villains alike, hero agencies were forced to close their doors by a fractured government. After Max Astral's fall from grace, a new figure took over the world in his place. And just overhead, a conflict between inhuman beings threatens to destroy the already desolated surface of Earth. Miyoko, a child without a family or known origin, must face his own internal conflicts. His mind is fractured into 6 distinct and polarizing personalities. Some are kind, and some are self-destructive. After discovering the remains of the Astral Family's crystals in the ruins of Maxcago, his alters are given life and power. He initially fights his alters, but over time, he learns to accept and legitimize their existence, allowing all 6 of them to fight the various villains that come their way. In doing so, they restore the honors of heroes past, and heroes return to daily life to restore the broken world. With them, just like the Astral Family before, leading a new generation of heroes. So yeah, that's gonna do it for today. Hopefully I didn't insult anybody, especially people with DID. I genuinely respect you guys, and I wanted to create a story that better showcases the different sides and facets of DID, rather than just labeling him as a, sociopath, with Split and other representations. So to people that are part of a DID system, I hope that this story validates you and just generally gives you a little bit of comfort, knowing that there is research, there are plenty of people out there who want to understand and will definitely support you. I know this one was a little bit long for a sequel video, and it took a while for me to make, with everything going on recently, but I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope that with Pride Month coming up, that you enjoy the content that will be coming very, very soon. So that's all for today. This is V for Verbatim, signing off until the next video. Take care, guys. They don't know what Caroline's life was like, and they just I'm making so many weird sounds. I just need to, open my mouth more. Okay. And also, we gotta have... Fuck! Gotta get a charger, actually. Be right back.